Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 710 through 712, which will cover manga chapters 771 through 773. And here we see the battle continue to heat up as more gladiators and executives begin to go down. Alright, so synopsis. While Luffy and Law have their hands busy with Doflamingo, Treble, and Bellamy, the rest of the gladiators down below and the other Straw Hats are trying to work together to get their way through the formidable Donquixote family executives as they face off against Laoji, Dellinger, and Gladius. Alright, so differences. There are some differences here. Some of them bigger than others, but first off, Zoro's fight with Pika in episode 711 is extended a little bit. In the manga, after Zoro takes note of Sai and how strong the Happo Navy is, it then cuts away to what is happening with Gladius and his fight versus Bartolomeo and Cavendish. So his little skirmish with Pika and him meeting Elisabello is kind of added. So the meeting with Elisabello is in the manga. And so him getting introduced to Elisabello is an actual important plot point that is in the manga. However, the extension is more so him dealing with Pika a little bit. And so there's like a couple minutes of added filler with that sort of interaction sandwiched in between or around the Elisabello meeting between Zoro and him. Another change is additionally the brief snippet of Kuros and Diamante's fight we get is moved after the previously mentioned scene with Elisabello and Zoro and all that stuff. In the manga, they actually happen in reverse. And so we see Kuros first, and then we go see what happens with Zoro and all of them. There's also a scene of Sabo helping people around Dressrosa, and somebody asking him to help him with the trapped prisoners and all that stuff. That's added filler as well. There's some more filler scenes of Luffy and Bellamy arguing about their unnecessary fight, mixed with actual canon material. Additionally, the scene originally took place much earlier in chapter 769, which would have put it somewhere near the episode 708, just after Doflamingo released Bellamy from the parasite. And so a lot of scenes get mixed around in this sort of like, I guess this maybe 10 chapters or so in this area. The other change is Law fighting Doflamingo and Treble after Bellamy gets his shot on Luffy is all filler. There's even a few more shots of Bellamy and Luffy fighting even after this, where Luffy takes that huge shot to the gut. In the manga, the scene actually just cuts off right there. You don't actually see any more of Luffy and Bellamy until it's revealed later how this fight ends. And so, yeah, all of that stuff is filler. In the manga, it just continues on to show Gladius fighting Bartolomeo and Cavendish. And then another change is the anime draws out the Dellinger defeat at the hands of Hakuba. In the manga, Dellinger actually just gets one-shotted and just falls over. But in the anime, he kind of like stands there for a little bit wondering what happened and how he was defeated. And then he gets slashed even more times. Which again, I prefer the manga version. I don't necessarily see this scene as an issue per se, but I just think it really highlights just how effing strong Hakuba really is comparatively. Because if you remember this scene, this moment just comes after just Dellinger just wiping the floor with Ideo, and up till now, no one has really been able to challenge Dellinger's sort of durability, his strength, his speed. And you then get to this scene where he just gets one-shotted, just completely slashed. He doesn't even know what hit him, and he's just gone. And so, yeah, I prefer the manga version because just getting hit once without him even knowing what happened to him is way more satisfying, just because of how humiliating that defeat is to someone like Dellinger. And it just shows and emphasizes just how much stronger Hakuba really is. And so, yeah, I prefer the manga version to this one. And then lastly, the anime has Hakuba try and attack the opening at the top of the barrier cylinder when Bartolomeo is just kind of standing there wondering what is happening. And then he kind of cinches the top to prevent him from getting in. That is added filler, although I find that really entertaining. It only added like a couple seconds, so I don't really care. But in the manga, it does just go from him wondering what's happened to then Hakuba turning his attention to Robin. That's kind of how it happens in the manga, and so that little added little joke of him trying to get into the top of the cylinder is pretty funny. All right, so with the differences out of the way, let's get into the episodes themselves. So, continuing on from the last set of episodes, we dive more into the gladiators fighting the Donquixote family executives as we see Lao Ji fighting Don Qinjiao, basically the fight of the grandpas. And all of Lao Ji's moves are some sort of play on many physical afflictions that kind of plague older people usually. So, Jioken or Geofist obviously plays on the same wordplay as his name, where Ji is sort of the prefix for old man in Japanese, as in like Ji-san is like an old guy. And all the moves he uses on Qinjiao are all kind of have double meanings. It's like the eye jab strain, which in Japanese is menotsukare, which is just strained eyes, or icy stiff shoulders, which is Japanese is katakori, which is literally just stiff shoulders in Japanese. There's an anime-only one called Poor Circulation Impact, which is called Hiesho, which in Japanese is referring to having a sensitivity to cold. And the chrysanthemum chestnut strained back, or gikkurigoshi, is just strained back in Japanese. The immortal warrior's joint pain, or fushiboshi no itami, is also just simply joint pain. All of these use the same words, but the kanji used in the attack makes them sound like fierce attack names. But when you actually say them, they're all just really like old people ailments that they deal with all the time, which unfortunately I'm starting to deal with some of them as well. Although I've always been a hiesho, like I've never really liked the cold. But anyways, there's also another joke that they admirably do a decent job translating, but is a little awkward because it's another wordplay in Japanese, and that's the joke where Lao Ji is mistakenly facing his men and not Qinjiao when he's kind of striking his finishing pose on him, and it leaves Qinjiao just kind of staring at Lao Ji's butt. And this joke actually makes more sense in the anime, as in the manga, Lao Ji isn't facing the wrong direction for some reason. And in any case, the gist of the joke is that Qinjiao seems like he's talking to Lao Ji, but in fact, he's been listening to Sai and Baby Five's interaction this whole time about them getting married and all that stuff, and is against their pairing as a married couple. So in English, they translate Qinjiao saying, "I'm on the other side of the fence," which kind of makes sense, but not really, since there's no actual fence anywhere. But this is the only phrase that they could come up with that could be used to make sense for telling Lao Ji that he's looking the wrong way, and also having the double meaning of being opposed to the marriage. And this is because in Japanese, what Qinjiao says is "hantai dazo," which in reference to Lao Ji means "you're flipped," or "I'm on the other side." And "hantai" basically means the opposite. But "hantai" can also mean like you're opposed to something, like you have the opposite viewpoint. And Lao Ji's character is absolutely insane, though, as he literally almost passes away just from standing there as his soul begins to move towards the afterlife until he has to come back to Earth to hear what was actually said to him. And even then, he didn't quite hear what Baby Five said to him. And this whole interaction is just Oda's sort of crazy comedy style on overdrive. And meanwhile, Sai is completely dumbfounded by what is happening between him and Baby Five, as he can't seem to comprehend what she's on about, and is rightfully very suspicious of her motives. But then something really unexpected and pretty sad happens, as she continues to say her essential life philosophy is, "Don't you need me? What do you want me to do? I'll do anything." And Sai takes this opportunity to kind of take advantage of the situation and just straight up tells her to end her life, thinking there's no way she'd do something like that. But shockingly and incredibly, and frankly, really sadly, she just gladly accepts and turns her arm into a gun and is completely willing to do exactly that, being genuinely happy that she's being useful to other people. And then we see why Baby Five is this way. And we get a brief flashback of what happened to Baby Five as a kid. And she was thrown away as a kid for being considered useless by her mother and her sort of nomadic clan, who were barely surviving. And from then on, she kind of grew up with a twisted idea that she was willing to do anything for anyone as long as they desired her and found her useful. And it kind of, and I don't know if this has ever been confirmed anywhere, but the name Baby Five, I think, was given to her because she was just the fifth baby in like this nomadic clan, and she didn't even get a real name. It seems like, which is really sad. But it was also kind of there's a kind of a funny bit when stuff like random people like proposing or her signing up for 50 newspaper subscriptions because people asked. But the fact that she like is traumatized by that experience of being thrown away by her mother, that she was getting actual joy and fulfillment at that idea of offering herself to be useful to another person is incredibly heartbreaking, like absurdly heartbreaking, to have someone that young with, such a promising life ahead of her to think that way about herself because of just being abandoned by her people, her mother, and who knows what happened to her father. And this is also probably what Doflamingo saw in Baby Five as a child, and why he recruited her, and why she was able to survive in the crew despite Corazon's best efforts to scare away kids. None of that mattered because she felt so useful to Doflamingo, and nothing was going to stop her from being where she felt needed, even if it was a very twisted form of need. But good guy Sai, who I'm also really starting to like as a character, realizes she's serious and doesn't want to win that way, nor let this person die like that, and jumps in to stop her. But his grandfather Qinjiao jumps in to stop him because he doesn't want his successor to be this merciful and forgiving, and attacks both of them. But Sai somehow manages to not only block Qinjiao's ultimate attack, but he rebends Qinjiao's head after Luffy just straightened it out. And I really like the next scene where Sai finally has a real conversation with Baby Five, because it just shows how terrible Doflamingo and pretty much everyone around her has been towards her. Baby Five, deep down, isn't necessarily evil or has that much malice in her heart. She just goes around doing things people tell her to do, essentially just as a tool or a weapon to be used, which is very poignant that Oda gave her the Buki Buki fruit, or the weapon fruit, which allows her to literally turn herself into a tool or a weapon, because as Sai says, she's lived in a world where no one has ever told her that that is not the only way to have value in this world. And I'm not to say, it's not to say that Baby Five is completely blameless in all the horrible things that she's done, but I think Oda up till now has been very careful about depicting Baby Five and the things that she's done. He's never really shown her doing anything remotely that terrible, even in the past or even in any of the two flashbacks or in the present day. I think because he was building up to this moment where, yeah, we can still somewhat accept the fact that, yeah, Baby Five could be reformed into, I don't want to say good guy, but yeah, at least have some sort of a redemption arc. Unfortunately, she doesn't really get a redemption arc per se, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But just when things were going in a happy direction with Sai's show of strength, Qinjiao has basically ceded all authority and passed on the Happon Navy to Sai, but Lao Ji comes in with a cheap shot. But worst of all is how Lao Ji talks about Baby Five, because it just, again, reinforces just how the entire Don Quixote family all view her as just a convenient tool to be used, which pisses Sai off, and not only declares that when he beats Lao Ji that he will take Baby Five as his wife, he goes on to finish him off and send him into a deep crevice, defeating the second Don Quixote family executive. And yeah, this was a pretty cool scene. And Sai is of course worried about Qinjiao just having took a massive shot from Lao Ji, but Baby Five is like completely enamored with the prospect of marriage. And funnily, she starts talking about like reserving locations for 2 events, and Sai's like, for what? And she mentions one's for their wedding and the other is for a funeral, to which Sai and Qinjiao are like, I'm not dead yet. And of course, we're still a long ways from the arc ending, but from here, most of Baby Five's story is done. And I kind of wanted to take a bit to talk about her character, because while it is humorous at times, I don't really like this ending for Baby Five, as she doesn't really grow or gain any sort of agency of her own. Like, you see slight glimpses that she is starting to come to the realization that maybe her worldview about herself is wrong, and she kind of registered that, there was something wrong with Lao Ji referring to her as a convenient tool. Like, you could see it on her face And it's not, she doesn't want to be utilized, but she's still sort of the delusional and troubled young woman that goes from one codependent relationship to another, albeit Sai, seemingly is a much better person to be with, at least. But what I really wanted to see was Baby Five go off kind of on her own, or maybe with another female character, or find friends and learn the real value of herself, not becoming, a doting, love-crazed person still. Like, she essentially traded Doflamingo with Sai in terms of her life circumstances in broad terms, but, and I'm not saying she's not better off, because of course not being with Doflamingo is way better than anything, but she's still essentially in the same place she started in terms of dealing with her traumatic past. And I don't know that this will really ever get fleshed out, since Oda really doesn't have much time to meaningfully develop Baby Five outside of maybe a few cover stories. But yeah, I kind of wish that there was a little bit more on the horizon for Baby Five, which, yeah, it kind of sucks. I do definitely criticize Oda for just kind of leaving it at that. But again, she's not even like a tertiary or a quaternary character. Like, she is very much a very, very supporting character, so it's like it's understandable that she's not going to get that much development. But one other side note to this whole fight is when Sai's original betrothed woman, Oclicia, I think is how you pronounce it, is mentioned in the manga, did not have an image of her, but in the anime we actually do get to see what Oclicia looks like, and that is because a fan, after this chapter came out, a fan asked Oda what Oclicia looks like in an SBS question, and he drew a quick sketch of her in his response, and that is ultimately the design that went in, that they did use for the anime. So what you're seeing is the sketch that Oda drew, and I believe it was volume 75 of the manga in the SBS, which is absolutely hilarious. Eventually, the focus shifts back to Zoro making note of just how strong the Hoppo Navy is after witnessing both Chinjao and particularly Sai, making sure to keep an eye on them if they ever turned out to be enemies, but that's short-lived as Pika returns to attacking Zoro, and this moment serves as a particular purpose that I can't really discuss without going into spoilers, but just file this away in your memory until we get to the end of the arc. Meanwhile, up in the flower garden, Kyros is struggling with Diamante as he's doing everything he can to make this fight as difficult as possible by taking every underhanded tactic available to him. Using his powers, he has made the ground unstable, which for a one-legged Kyros makes it extremely difficult for him to maintain any sort of balance, hampering his ability to fight. But on top of that, he keeps going after Rebecca, making Kyros have to do nothing but run back and forth, protecting her in an effort to make it so that she never has to fight again, and to atone for what he perceives as a failure to protect Scarlet, declaring that now that he's a human, he will no longer let his daughter wield a sword again, which I have a few things to discuss about this, but not probably for the reason you think. I actually don't really have a problem with this in and of itself, and I know some people see it as kind of like misogynistic of Kyros to assume the protector role, but I don't think that's what's going on, since Rebecca herself has stated that she has no desire to really fight. She's only offering to help in this moment because her father is in mortal danger. But also, again, keep in mind, Rebecca is still a child here despite her design, which is always very confusing to a lot of people. She's supposed to be 16 years old. No father is going to want her let their child fight against a known fearsome murderer. And my thought lies more in what happens later on in regards to this statement, which I'll discuss in the spoiler section. Now we finally get back to what's probably the most emotionally charged plot thread currently, and that is the Luffy versus Bellamy fight. Now Bellamy starts to finally accept that he's made a mistake following the wrong man, but his pride won't let him stand down because he feels that because he's the one that pursued Doflamingo, and that if he gives up on those ideals and goals just because the outcome wasn't what he wanted, that he'll be an even worse person than someone who just made a mistake. And this goes back to what Oda always emphasizes, which is the worst fate of anyone in the One Piece world, and the reason why he rarely kills his villains, is he stated that having their dreams dashed by Luffy is a fate far worse than death. And so what he's trying to say is that he doesn't kill anyone because losing their dreams is worse than death in the world of One Piece. And Bellamy, unfortunately, here has taken that to an extreme where he'd rather die from exhaustion or his injuries at the hands of Luffy than to betray his ideals and dreams. And as heartbreaking as that is, it just proves how far Bellamy has come, that he is willing to die for his ideals and dreams, even if they're misguided. And in the past, like when you look at Bellamy from the Pope or pre-time skip, he would mock and ridicule anyone that would, in his eyes, be stupid enough to dream and let alone put their life on the line for that stupid dream. And that alone means Bellamy has changed for the better. He just needs help getting back on the right track, following a dream that's actually worth this level of dedication and effort. And one other aspect I really like about this fight, and particularly in the anime, is that part that calls back to the idea of a fight worth taking. Bellamy calls out to Luffy saying that this is his last fight and tells him to accept it and take the fight, calling back to their interaction at the bar in Mocktown during the Skypiea arc, where Luffy didn't take that fight because, in his words, it wasn't worth it, and even told Zoro to stand down and not take the fight because if you remember, Bellamy was the man who not only didn't have any dreams of his own, he mocked the very idea of anyone else having dreams. And thus, to Luffy, this was not a man worth fighting because, again, in Oda's words, this guy is already, in essence, dead. They wouldn't be fighting for anything meaningful, and Luffy never takes fights just to fight. And as Shanks had shown him as a kid, all the way back at the beginning of the series, that these types of fights are just not worth it. So Bellamy calling out to Luffy saying he wants him to take his last fight is him proving to Luffy and himself that he is a man that has dreams and is recognized as a man worthy of Luffy taking the fight. By this point in the series, he understands painfully why Luffy didn't take that fight 2 years ago, and how it was because he wasn't worthy of Luffy even taking that fight. Because now, seeing how good and great of a person Luffy is, he wants his last act to be recognized by Luffy, which is amazing growth, but also incredibly tragic. And unfortunately, we won't get to see the conclusion to this fight for quite some time, so we'll have to put a pin in it for now. I really wish we could kind of wrap this whole situation in a bundle so that I can actually talk about the entire implication of this fight, but unfortunately, Oda has to put this way into the future. I think it takes probably 7 or 8 chapters before it gets to this point again. But anyways, moving on, we do move on to another executive fight, following up with Bartolomeo and Cavendish's fight with Gladius. And there's a funny little moment where Cavendish finds himself stuck in the explosive range of Gladius's punk rock fest attack, and he's just frustratingly trying to have Bartolomeo let him into the barrier so as to not get caught up in the explosion. And he eventually lets him in. But the one thing I began to really notice about this pair is just how similar they're becoming, like Zoro and Sanji. Like, they're both, like, when you look at them, one is a green-haired, kind of rebellious-looking guy, and the other is a blonde-haired, like, prim and proper-looking guy. That both are constantly annoying each other and getting in each other's faces because of how different they are, which is undeniably hard not to notice this when they're bickering with each other, especially in this moment. And not to mention seeing Bartolomeo going nuts over Robin, giving him a wink is also, that's another really funny moment too with, it's just so, I guess, very relatable, to us fans. And meanwhile, Ideo is also still trying to take on Dellinger, but Dellinger is just far stronger than he looks, to where it looks like he's never really trying and almost just playing with his quote-unquote food. And we learn just where his insane strength and durability comes from. It's here he reveals that he's not just a normal human, and in fact, he's half fishman. But not just any fishman, he is a hybrid of the fighting fish. And so, those ferocious fish that we've seen throughout the arc that Doflamingo has been using in and around Dressrosa is who he recruited to his crew, which is very fitting, I suppose. And fun fact about this is that this is the first time Oda would use a fictional fish that he himself created as the base for a fish person. Because up until now, all the fish people and mer people he's created were based on real fish that exist in our real world. Unfortunately, this would end Ideo's fight where Dellinger then just moves up to catch up to Gladios, but when he gets there, it's eerily quiet for a battlefield, aside from the faint screams of people getting slashed by some unknown entity until it slashes him. And I love this moment because it's so freaking satisfying seeing that little cocky shit finally get such a humiliating defeat. This whole time, Dellinger has been this annoying, condescending, arrogant little prick that no one has been able to do anything about because he keeps picking on opponents that are clearly weaker than him and just constantly boasts about it right up until the very end. And he's still boasting about how no one can beat them, even while Gladius is trying to warn him that to stay away, it's not safe here. And out of nowhere, he just gets one-shotted by what is revealed to be Hakuba, Cavendish's insomniac alter ego, and he doesn't even know what hit him. And again, like I said in the manga, he just passes out without ever knowing. And yeah, Cavendish himself is pretty strong, but when Hakuba comes out, that guy is crazy scary. Like in the past, we mentioned the whole Jekyll and Hyde aspect, but he's more like the Incredible Hulk, an immensely powerful yet uncontrollable force that just kills indiscriminately and seems to enjoy it. He tries going after Bartolomeo, but because he can't get through the barrier, he turns his attention to the one other person that is still moving, and that's Robin. And amazingly, even despite his blinding speed, Robin manages to restrain him with her Hana powers, and leaving us on this sort of cliffhanger of how they're going to handle Hakuba. And don't forget, technically Gladius is still standing there as well. So now they have to figure out how to deal with both Hakuba and Gladius. And luckily, when I first read this in the manga, this is where the chapter began. So we got to see how all of this unfolded. But the anime takes the cliffhanger and puts it here. So we have to wait till the next episode to see what happens, unfortunately. So yeah, we'll talk about that on the next podcast. But yeah, that's where we'll kind of end it here. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. As always, I wanted to thank you for joining me on this journey of rewatching One Piece. So please consider subscribing and check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes and to see pictures of my manga collection. And as always, thanks for taking the time out to listen. Small spoiler section, just kind of a quick little side note about Kuros. But other than that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! So yeah, just a couple quick notes. The thing about Kuros, not letting Rebecca ever wield the sword again is interesting because one thing we see in one of the more recent arcs in Egghead is when we cut to the various different kingdoms seeing Dr. Vegapunk's message. When it cuts to Dressrosa, we see Rebecca is actually training with Kuros to fight more. So yeah, that was interesting that, despite declaring that he's never gonna, have Rebecca have to fight again, it seems like Rebecca is actually wanting to train more. And I think a lot of people found this to either be confusing, problematic, or inconsistent on Oda's part, but I think it makes sense because just before this moment, at the Reverie, Rebecca witnessed seeing like just how in danger a princess can be, and particularly what happened to Shirahoshi and not being able to help protect her. I think, and also, with BB going missing at the same Reverie, I think witnessing both of that and hearing that news could have maybe motivated Rebecca to want to continue picking up her fighting abilities again, not so much so that she can, because she wants to fight, but because she wants to be able to protect the people that she cares about, because she made friends with Shirahoshi and BB, and both of them are now in trouble as far as she knows. And so I think that may have basically it's never outright stated, and I don't think it's been brought up in any SBS yet, but I think that's maybe why Rebecca has resumed her training with her father, because she wants to be able to protect people. And I wholeheartedly believe that Rebecca will eventually come back and somehow help them all whenever the final war happens, because I think everyone's going to show back up to help Luffy and the Straw Hats with whatever war that they're facing. You know, there's no world in which, you know, the folks of Dressrosa and Wano and Arabasta and all those people and Fishman Island, they don't come back to help him. And so, yeah, I have to imagine that Rebecca is also training to do so. And I think Kuros understands that, and that's why he's willing to train her. But yeah, that's kind of really the only thing I wanted to talk about. Of course, I could talk about sort of that thing I alluded to with Sai and how Zoro kind of took note of him. But I think I'll save that for when that actually becomes relevant, when the whole reveal with the Straw Hat Grand Fleet happens. But yeah, in any case, yeah, that's pretty much all I really wanted to talk about. So if you stayed around, thank you, and I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.